What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to Knives of the Round Table. My name is Marco, and today we're going to be talking about the evolution of knife collecting. And this video is going to be for two kinds of people. One is for that person that has started their collection and wants to know where to go next, right? What's the next step if they wanted to get the next step of their knives, if they wanted to to make that jump or to add a grail to their collection, what would it be? So that's one type. For the other type is for the skeptic, right? For the one that says, how does somebody get from a, $20, $50 knife to a $200 or a $400 or a $1,000 knife? How do we get there? And the truth is that we don't get there overnight, right? It's a process, it's an evolution. So that's what this video is all about today. And for most people, knife collecting starts here. And I'm gonna show an example of a knife in a certain kind of bracket of sorts, but not a specific knife, not a specific model is what I'm trying to say. So for a lot of people, knife collecting starts with a Swiss Army knife, right? Maybe it's the little one if you got it when you were a kid. Maybe it's the classic Victorinox, or maybe it's kind of this larger version of the knife. A multi-tool. A lot of people, parents give it to their kids or grandparents to their grandkids. But for a lot of people, knife collecting starts with a Swiss Army knife in some shape or fashion. For a few, it might be like a case knife that gets handed down through the generations, or like a buck 110 kind of a thing. But I think that for a lot of people, and a lot of people that I've talked to, the Swiss Army knife is kind of where it starts. But then, so we're gonna set this off to the side here, and then we're gonna talk. So then what happens? Well, what happens is that you're walking down your Walmart or your Academy or your Bass Pro Shops or whatever, and then you see that there's a whole aisle dedicated to just dedicated blades, right? It's your CRKTs, your Gerbers, Smith and Wesson or whatever, and you see that there's a lot of knives that have a dedicated blade, right? Just the blade. That's all they are. In this case, I'm representing it with this Kershaw Blur. And it has a pocket clip, it's a liner lock, and this is where you say, well, maybe I don't need all of the tools here, and I just want to have a blade that is sitting in my pocket, with a pocket clip. It sits very comfortable in there. And then you see that there's there's a lot of designs, right? This has a lot of design, right? It has, the finger grooves, it has a different blade shape, and so it tickles your imagination, right? It's something that you're like, oh, that's interesting. Let me take a look at that. So, this knife is getting close to this price in that same range, except that this is a single blade, right? So we're not talking about fancy steel here. We're just talking about the jump from this kind of multi-tool that a lot of people have to you having a dedicated blade in your pocket. And that's kind of the first step in the evolution, at least in my experience. And I've talked to some people on their evolution of knife collecting, and most people's stories follow a version of this, right? Nobody's story is gonna follow exactly this, but for a lot of people, it'll be some kind of variation of this. And then what happened is, after this, you start researching, right? And what I did is I looked best folding knives, right? And what that led me to was a Blade HQ's channel, okay? And it took me a little while. I was a little slow on the ball, but when they talk about the best folding knives, it's a little bit of a clickbait because they say best folding knife, but what they really mean is best selling folding knife. And that leads you down the Benchmade path, right? And Benchmade has very attractive designs. All of a sudden, you start talking about blade steels, right? When I started, S30V was very prevalent. But now you start talking about, well, you start talking about a knife that has superior steel, right, to this. You start talking about action, right? You have a knife that does that. You start talking about locking mechanisms. You start talking about different materials. In this case, it has aluminum, but you have carbon fiber, you have titanium. You start talking about those kinds of things. And for me, it was the first time that I took a jump to a $200 range knife, 180 in that range. And in my case, it cost me $125. It was the Benchmade Contego. I'm representing Benchmade here with Bug Out. But the one that I got was the Benchmade Contego. It was a KnifeWorks exclusive, an M390 steel. It's a massive knife. But that was like my first jump into this bracket. And I think it's a solid jump. When you jump, Benchmade has a really good lineup. So that's where you go from here. For me, I didn't have anybody in my immediate circle of family and friends that was into the knife hobby. So that's why I ended up here. Now, for some people, instead of going to Benchmade, you might go into Spyderco. Now, Spyderco, in my opinion, Spyderco is not as beautiful knives as Benchmade's, aesthetically. I think they're outstanding tools, and I think they might be better tools than Benchmade's. But they're not. They're weird looking. They've got these weird shapes. It's an acquired taste in my opinion. But if you have somebody in your knife circle, then maybe they suggested to go with a pair two or a pair three, a Spyderco. Now this one has aftermarket scales, and it's a little nicer than your regular stock Spyderco, but maybe you go in that direction, right? So this is kind of the same kind of step right here. Spyderco, Benchmade, they kind of live in the same step. And then you're looking at more stuff, right? And you start looking at more channels, Nick Shabazz, Metal Complex, whatever. And for me, I came across the ZT-0562. Now, in fairness, what I actually came up with, or the one that I discovered, was the Hinderer XM18. But the jump from a $150 knife to $180 knife to a $425 knife was a big jump, and I wasn't ready to take that one. But if you listen to people describe the XM18, you're most likely gonna find out that the ZT-0562 is a Hinderer design. It was designed by Rick Hinderer, and it's modeled after the XM18, but it is only like $280. So it is significantly less expensive than an XM18. So for me, I jumped onto this one. This was my next step into here. And now you're getting into the really good production knives, right? ZT has really good fit and finish. The Hinderer design is outstanding. You've got carbon fiber, you have a titanium frame lock, you got a lock bar insert, you got an over trouble stop, deep carry pocket clip. There's a lot to like here. It's a beautiful knife. The lines are really attractive. So I wasn't quite ready to go full on XM18. So I took the next step and I got the 0562. And I think this is kind of a gateway knife. I think this is an outstanding knife. This is outstanding value. I've made the argument before that this knife is the point of diminishing returns, okay? Every knife before this one, you double the price, you double the quality, or the or the value of what you're getting, okay? But after this one, double the price does not necessarily mean double the quality. It's the point of diminishing returns, okay? You start along this curve, and then when you hit this knife, you kind of start flattening out. Yes, the knives above this price point are better, but they're not proportional to their price points. So I got the ZT-0562, and that was I think that was the end for me. That at that point, my knife collecting was gonna take a serious acceleration, if you will, because after that, my next clear step was an XM18, right? And you know, because I saw I had the 0562, and it was such a good knife, and my experience with it was so good that I was wondering, well, you know, I really want to try and experience a real XM18 and kind of compare and contrast. And my jump into Hinderer led me down a path of collecting a lot of Hinderers. I have, I don't know, 5 or 6. I have one of his customs. I have this that is a special edition. This is called the Containment Series. There are not very many of these. But I saw that there's a lot of blade shapes, a lot of blade grinds, a lot of finishes, colors, customizations that you can do to these knives. So a lot of people get to the Hinderer version, or to the Hinderer stage of their collecting, and stay there. And you can, and make no mistake, you can stay your entire life and do your entire hobby just collecting Rick Hinderer knives. You can spend from, you know, $300 to well over $2,000, depending on the version of the knife that you're wanting to get. And that was awesome, because I knew that Rick Hinderer was one of the original holy trinity of knife makers, right? Mick Strider, Rick Hinderer, and Chris Reeves. Now, when I started collecting, Mick Strider was no longer producing knives. You know, he produces some customs, but his production line had already stopped. So I would only be able to, unless I go secondary market with it, I was only going to be able to experience Hinderer and Chris Reeves. And because of my experience with the ZT-0562, I jumped into Rick Hinderer. And this was awesome. The tri-way pivot is incredible. The action is great. The fit and finish is outstanding. Ergonomics are so good on Rick Hinderer knives. I've been a fan of Rick Hinderer knives for a long, long time. So this is the one that I got next. And because I had already started with the holy trinity of knife collecting, then the next logical step for me was another knife maker in the holy trinity of knife collecting, and that's Chris Reeves. So obviously most people will start with a Svensa, and so did I. I started with a Svensa. It may have been a Numnumzan. Don't quote me on it, but I decided to go to the Chris Reeves. And again, this is meant to be not this specific knife, but a knife in this bracket, right? A Rick Hinderer knife. So next I went Chris Reeves. And with Chris Reeves, you know, you get kind of a different feel. It's a little less tactical first responder than a Hinderer is. It doesn't have quite the action. It is the definition of hydraulic and glassy smooth. It's kind of a slow rollout knife. It's more elegant. It's probably a little bit less hard used than the XM18, but it is the fit and finish. Once you experience the Chris Reeves fit and finish, you kind of raise your bar on what you're expecting from knives. And so my evolution, because I had already gone to one of the holy trinity, I decided to go with another one. For some, depending on if you went with a different CT and you decided not to go with a Hinderer, this may have been your first knife in that bracket. So then I went with the Chris Reeves. So Chris Reeves is where I went next. And after that, Now you're really into the hobby, right? You're spending $450 in this bracket, and now you've done your research, you've seen a bunch of channels, you've seen a bunch of videos, and there's some names that start to kind of filter through the grapevine, right? Every time they talk about action, inevitably, they're gonna talk about the Grimsmo action. And the Grimsmo action is legendary for a reason. It's one of the drop shuttiest knives you'll ever find. Okay, the deployment action is okay. The detent's a little strong in my personal estimation, but the drop shot action is just phenomenal. The precision milling that they have going on here is amongst the best of the production knife world. It is just phenomenal. The shape of the Grimsmo Norseman, I think, is fairly iconic. I don't, I have many knives, and I have none that look like this. They have very, very good fit and finish. You see these lines, but even when you pass your finger through it, you can barely feel them. It's outstanding what they have been able to achieve. And you hear every time Nick Shabazz talks about action, he tells you that everything gets compared to the drop shot guillotine action of the Grimsmo Norseman. And because of that, you start to think, well, I should maybe experience that as a knife collector. So the next step in the evolution for me was to this. Now there's a fairly big jump between here and here, and there aren't a whole heck of a lot of knives in this price range between here and here. In the $600-700 range, there aren't a whole heck of a lot. Yes, there are some in the secondary market, but new, you're maybe looking at something like a Hoback Sumo or something like that. But that's even closer to like the $500 range. But there's a big jump, there's a big gap in between the $450 range and the $900 range that the Norseman is at. And then because you're talking about legendary fit and finish and legendary actions, the next step and the next name that you will hear very often is Shirogorov, right? And Shirogorovs, I was well into my knife collecting before I came across Shirogorovs. They're not as easy to get. They're not as plentiful. Even the Grimsmo Norseman is far more prevalent, right? You can find it on their website. They have drops probably every week or every 2 weeks. They drop 20 knives or so, and you can get it. I'm not going to say easily, but easier than you can get a Shirogorov. And when I got my hands on the F3NS that you see here, it is just the best knife I've ever held. It's just the best knife I've ever held. The blade comes down to a super thin edge. It is pristine. It is perfect. The fit and finish, the chamfering that they've done, this jimping, the materials that they've used. There's carbon fiber, and then there's this carbon fiber. And this one, I don't know if it comes across in the camera, but it shimmers. It's just an incredible carbon fiber with blue accents on it. It is incredible. And this knife, it's a liner lock, but the liners are super, super thick, and so it behaves more like a frame lock for all intents and purposes. The action is phenomenal. It's the best action that I've ever felt. I just wanted to experience a knife like in this bracket. The ergonomics on this are perfect. There's nothing of this knife that I don't like, and this is the kind of the pinnacle of the evolution of your knife collecting for production knives. So that's kind of where it gets to now. Again, this is a bracket, right? So maybe you put in here, instead of Shirogorov, maybe you put in here like something like the Koenig Arius, right? It's something that kind of that almost matches the fit and finish and the design and everything that a Shirogorov has, and it's kind of in that price bracket, right? Now above that, from this it gets more expensive, and above that you get custom knives, right? And custom knives, the argument can be made that a lot of them are prettier, but I'm not sure that the argument can be made that they are better. Uh, and I haven't gone too much into the custom knife world, because zirconium and Damascus and really fancy Damascus and bejeweled and engraved stuff lives over in that side. And I think, I'm gonna stick in this range. I do have one or two custom knives, but for the most part, I think I've enjoyed my production knives a lot better. And then what happens? So you're here. You've sampled all of this. Now what? Well, now you get to experience smaller knife makers, right? This, the brands that you see represented here are big brands, right? Swiss Army, Kershaw, Benchmade, Spyderco, ZT, Hinderer, Chris Reeves, Grimsmo, and Shirogorov, right? And this is the equivalent of, of those first 2 or 3 trips to Europe, right? Where you kind of you hit Rome, and you hit Barcelona, and you hit Paris, and you hit London, and you hit Amsterdam, right? You have to hit all of the major, big, important, beautiful sites, right? But it is until your 4th or 5th trip, once you have probably some Spider, because you have a couple Benchmades, maybe you've expanded your collection over here somehow, you have some of these knives already, and then you start looking for that beautiful bed and breakfast in the French Riviera, right? You start looking for that beautiful little town in the Sicilian coast, something like that. And that's where you start coming across things like TRM, for instance, right? It's a really small company that makes really good knives, and they are actually probably in this price range, right? In the $200 price range. But they are harder to get. They're small manufacturer. You have to be ready for a drop. This is not a knife that you're just gonna hit DLT trading and they're gonna have them. That's not how it's gonna happen. You're gonna have to be on the ball for this kind of thing. But they are outstanding knives, and they're very much worth having in your collection. Or you start finding out something like Urban EDC Supply, right, where they do these drops. This is the F5.5, and it is an outstanding knife. It is just really beautifully done. But again, this is something that is going to be based on drops. This is not something that you're going to find on most websites. A lot of times they're restricted to a certain number, and you're going to have to kind of hunt them down. But you start getting into knives that that are more unique, that are not as plentiful, that are not a lot of people will have this knife, a lot of people will have that knife, many people have that knife. Not that many people have this knife. At least the ratio of people who have this knife to those is very, very low, right? Or you might even get something like a Riyadh, right? Riyadh lives kind of in this price point right around here, right? A little bit less than Hinderer knives, a little more than ZT, right? And these guys, they produce outstanding quality knife for a lot of knife makers. This is the Chavez Redención Street in the drop point blade, and they have such an outstanding fit and finish. They have such an outstanding action on these knives that a lot of makers use Riyadh for their knives. So the Chavez Redención is an example of that, and the Peña knives. This is the Mula. They also use Riyadh for their production, and I found that I enjoyed these knives quite a bit. The action, their price point, their quality, so even though I have more expensive knives, I found that my enjoyment of the Riyadh made knives has been actually very, very, very good, and I think they produce outstanding knives. Or you might go with something like this. This is the Quiet Carry Drift, right? And again, now this one, it has been surprisingly more available than I thought it was going to be, but you can only get it from Quiet Carry as far as I know. It is a fully rust-proof knife, right? But again, this is kind of a knife that you get to, after you've hit a lot of these other benchmarks, then you start getting into these more, I'm not gonna say niche, but smaller produced knives. And the final knife that I'm gonna tell you of this bracket is something like the Brian Brown Jaeger, right? And this could be your something obscene company Jacob, or this could be your Vero Engineering, right? But this type of maker that has, very incredibly different design, right? Outstanding quality, outstanding fit and finish, but they are not plentiful, okay? These are knives that you're gonna have to track down, hunt down, get on the secondary market, or be really, really on the ball with your clicks when you decide to buy it on a drop. So I think for a lot of people, their knife collecting takes this shape, and then you decide to settle down on a certain kind of area. And for me, it's been kind of in this area from 300 to 450. You will find that most of my collection, if you draw the Gauss bell, I'm gonna live in that area. A lot of these knives are in that price point, and I've enjoyed collecting those knives quite a bit, even though I have knives that are significantly more expensive than that. But guys, let me know kind of your evolution of your top 10 kind of knives in your evolution of knife collecting. If you want to do something like this top one for me, leave it in the comments. That'd be interesting to know how you got from this point to this point, or wherever you decided to go. Now, I want to make a disclaimer here, and maybe I should have done the disclaimer at the beginning of the video, but here it is. For a lot of people, this will be a lot of money to spend on a knife. For some people, this will be a lot of money to spend on a knife. For some people, they will never go above this price point. For some people, they will never go above this price point. This is kind of a personal preference depending on your personal economics, right? For a millionaire, he's gonna be able to just collect Shirogorovs, right? Just get me another one, right? For some people, a Hinder knife would be a Grail knife, and that's an outstanding Grail knife. And I think regardless of where you're at, if you were here, maybe this is your Grail knife, then I would say, awesome, you can do a lot of collecting in this price point. If this is your Grail knife, then you can do a lot of collecting over here. Even though I have this knife, for example, I've enjoyed collecting all of these knives. Just getting some of these knives and having them in my collection has just been very, very enjoyable. So guys, hopefully this has been enjoyable to you. Hopefully you stuck through it until the end. Hopefully you liked it. If you did, if I earned it, then like and subscribe. Don't hit notifications. Nobody likes to get more emails. Hopefully you know where to find my content if you want to see more. And until I see you at the next one, take care.